Hello there, wherever you are in the world right now. I hope your day has been treating you well, whether you're listening to this in the bright morning hours, during a quiet afternoon, or perhaps in those mysterious late night hours when the world feels different somehow. What time is it where you are? Are you somewhere warm where the sun is shining? Or maybe you're in a place where winter has settled in and the darkness comes early. No matter where you're tuning in from, I'm glad you're here with us tonight. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to remind you to subscribe to Sleep Theories if you haven't already. We bring you stories that explore the hidden corners of our world, the unexplained phenomena that make you question what's really happening behind the scenes. Tonight's tale is particularly unsettling, touching on the thin line between science and conspiracy, between natural phenomena and human manipulation. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me tell you about Dr. Camden Rourke and the discovery that would ultimately cost him everything. This is the story of Project Cybele, the HAARP protocol, and the terrifying possibility that the weather itself might not be as natural as we think. The rain hammered against the windows of the small NOAA research station in Manila with an intensity that defied meteorological explanation. Dr. Camden Rourke stood before a wall of monitors, each screen displaying satellite imagery, atmospheric pressure readings, and wind velocity measurements that painted a picture of impossible chaos. Super typhoon. Esperanza had formed in 18 hours. Not 18 days, not even 18 hours from the first signs of tropical disturbance. 18 hours from completely clear skies to a Category 5 monster that was now tearing through the Philippine archipelago with winds exceeding 200 miles per hour. Camden had been tracking tropical systems for 12 years. He had seen hurricanes develop rapidly, had witnessed the awesome power of nature when atmospheric conditions aligned perfectly. But this was different. This was wrong. The pressure gradient doesn't make sense, he muttered to himself, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he studied the data streams. His fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up historical comparisons, searching for any precedent for what he was witnessing. Dr. Sarah Chen, the station director, appeared at his shoulder. "Camden, you need to see this." Her voice carried an edge that made him look up from his screens immediately. She handed him a printed weather report, the kind of official document that would be transmitted to emergency management agencies across the region. The predicted path of Esperanza showed the storm making landfall near Tacloban, the same city that had been devastated by Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. "This is based on your modelling?" Sarah asked. Camden nodded, but his brow furrowed as he looked at the paper. "Based on the atmospheric data, yes. But Sarah, look at these formation patterns." He turned back to his monitors, pulling up a time-lapse satellite loop. "The eye wall developed from the outside in. I've never seen convection patterns like this." The storm's spiral arms moved with an almost mechanical precision, each band of clouds rotating at exactly the same rate. It was mesmerizing and deeply unsettling. Nature was chaotic, unpredictable. This looked engineered. "Camden," Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, "I got a call from Washington an hour ago. They want you to adjust your report." "Adjust it how?" "They want you to remove any references to the anomalous formation patterns. They want the report to reflect normal tropical cyclogenesis." Camden stared at her. "But that would be falsifying data. This storm formed in a way that I've never seen before. The scientific community needs to know about this. We need to study what conditions could cause." "Camden," Sarah's voice was firm now. "This comes from the top, way above my pay grade. They're concerned about panic, about people questioning whether we can predict these storms accurately." "But we can't predict them if we don't understand them." Camden's voice rose with frustration. "Look at this electromagnetic data." He pulled up another screen showing radio frequency measurements taken during the storm's formation. "There are massive EM spikes right before the eye wall developed. That's not normal solar activity. That's not anything I've seen in nature." Sarah glanced around the research station. The other meteorologists were pointedly not looking in their direction, suddenly very interested in their own work. "Camden, please, just file the standard report. Call it rapid intensification due to favourable upper-level divergence and sea surface temperatures." Camden looked at the screen one more time. The electromagnetic signature was clear, a pattern of high-frequency pulses that had preceded the storm's formation by exactly 47 minutes. It looked almost like a signal, like someone had been broadcasting into the atmosphere right before nature went haywire. I can't do that, Sarah. I won't. 3 weeks later, Camden was escorted from the NOAA building in Silver Spring, Maryland. His security clearance was revoked, his access to research systems terminated, and his 12-year career in atmospheric science officially ended. The official reason given was failure to maintain scientific objectivity in crisis situations. The unofficial reason, whispered in hallways and discussed in hushed tones over coffee, was that Camden Rourke had asked too many questions about Super Typhoon Esperanza. By February 2026, Camden was living in a small cabin outside Juneau, Alaska, as far from tropical storms and government oversight as he could manage. The isolation suited him. He had always been more comfortable with data than with people, more at ease reading atmospheric patterns than reading social cues. But isolation couldn't quiet his scientific mind. Even here, surrounded by snow-covered peaks and glacial valleys, he found himself studying weather patterns. Old habits died hard. The aurora appeared on the night of January 13th, 2026. Camden was outside his cabin, checking the propane tank connection for his generator, when the northern sky began to glow. At first, he thought nothing of it. Aurora borealis was common in Alaska, a natural consequence of solar particles interacting with Earth's magnetic field. But as he watched, something felt wrong. The lights weren't moving in the usual flowing patterns. Instead, they pulsed in regular intervals, like a heartbeat made of green and blue fire across the heavens. Camden went inside and checked his laptop. Solar activity was minimal. The Space Weather Prediction Center showed no geomagnetic storms, no coronal mass ejections, nothing that should produce aurora of this intensity. The lights pulsed for exactly 17 minutes, then vanished as abruptly as they had appeared. 6 hours later, a microburst struck a group of hikers in Denali National Park. The localized downburst was so intense it created winds of over 150 miles per hour in a space no larger than a football field. 6 people died instantly, their bodies found scattered across the tundra like broken dolls. Camden read about it in the Anchorage Daily News 3 days later. A freak weather event, they called it. An unfortunate reminder of nature's unpredictability. But Camden knew better. He had seen the electromagnetic signature before in the Philippines right before Esperanza had formed. The same high-frequency pulses, the same unnatural precision. That night he made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find out what was really happening in the skies above Alaska. The NOAA archives were vast and largely digital, but Camden still had friends in the agency. Dr. Marcus Webb had been his roommate in graduate school, and more importantly, Marcus was the kind of person who believed that data should be freely available to anyone doing legitimate research. "I can give you read-only access to the historical atmospheric data," Marcus told him over an encrypted video call. "But Camden, if anyone asks, you're researching climate patterns for a book you're writing." "What kind of book?" "I don't know, something innocuous. Weather patterns of the Pacific Northwest, Arctic atmospheric phenomena. Just nothing that sounds like you're investigating government weather modification programs." Camden paused. "Who said anything about weather modification?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Camden, I've heard the rumours about why you were really let go, about the electromagnetic anomalies you reported during Esperanza. Look, I don't know what you think you found, but be careful. There are people who don't want certain questions asked." The call ended, but 2 hours later Camden received an email with temporary access credentials to the NOAA historical database. He immediately began pulling data from the past 18 months, focusing on electromagnetic readings from monitoring stations across Alaska. What he found made his blood run cold. Every 29 days, without exception, there was a massive electromagnetic pulse centered approximately 300 miles northeast of Juneau. The location corresponded to a small town called Gakona, which Camden recognized as the site of the high-frequency active auroral research program facility. HAARP was supposedly a research installation designed to study the ionosphere, the upper layer of Earth's atmosphere. Camden had read papers about their work, legitimate scientific studies about radio wave propagation and atmospheric physics. But the data he was seeing suggested something far more active than passive research. The pulses were designated in the system as Signal 88K, and they had been occurring with clockwork regularity for over 2 years. Each pulse lasted exactly 17 minutes, the same duration as the aurora he'd witnessed on January 13th. Camden cross-referenced the dates of the 88K signals with global weather events, and the pattern that emerged was deeply disturbing. December the 15th, 2024, Signal 88K at 14:23 GMT. 17 hours later, a 7.2 magnitude earthquake struck western Turkey, killing over 3,000 people. January 13th, 2025, Signal 88K at 09:17 GMT. Within 6 hours, unprecedented hailstorms battered central Chile, destroying an entire harvest season and triggering widespread unrest as food prices skyrocketed. February 11th, 2025, Signal 88K at 22:45 GMT. The next morning, massive electrical blackouts affected Jakarta, Manila and Bangkok simultaneously, attributed to solar storm activity despite minimal space weather. March 12th, 2025, Signal 88K at 06:33 GMT. That afternoon, protests erupted in 3 separate countries, experiencing unusual low-pressure weather systems, all of which had been perfectly stable politically just days before. The correlation was impossible to ignore. Every time HAARP transmitted Signal 88K, somewhere in the world, nature seemed to go haywire. Camden spent 3 sleepless nights analysing the data before he realised he needed help. This was bigger than atmospheric science, bigger than weather modification. If his suspicions were correct, someone was using the ionosphere itself as a weapon. He needed to contact someone with experience in signals intelligence, someone who understood the intersection of electromagnetic manipulation and human behaviour. He needed Nia LaForge. Nia had left the NSA under circumstances almost as murky as Camden's departure from NOAA. She had been a cryptographic linguist, specialising in the analysis of digital communications patterns, but she had started asking questions about certain signals that seemed designed not to communicate information, but to influence the people receiving them. According to the last interview she had given before disappearing from public view, she believed that various government agencies were experimenting with electromagnetic behavioural modification, using radio frequencies to induce specific psychological states in target populations. Most people had dismissed her as another paranoid ex-government worker spinning conspiracy theories, but Camden had read her academic papers from before her government service, and he knew she was brilliant. If anyone could help him understand what Signal 88K was really doing, it was Nia. Finding her took 2 weeks and several intermediaries in the digital privacy community. When she finally agreed to meet, it was in a coffee shop in Fairbanks, about as far from any government installation as they could manage while still being in the same state as HAARP. Nia LaForge was smaller than Camden had expected, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of intense focus that came from years of analysing patterns that others couldn't see. She arrived at their meeting with a briefcase full of old files and a portable electromagnetic field detector that looked like it had been cobbled together from spare parts. "Dr. Rourke," she said, settling into the booth across from him, "I've heard about your work on Esperanza, and I've been tracking Signal 88K for almost as long as you have." Camden nearly choked on his coffee. "You know about 88K?" "I know about a lot more than 88K. The signal you've been tracking isn't random, and it isn't just for weather modification." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents that looked like they had been photocopied multiple times to obscure their origin. "It's based on research that goes back to the Cold War. Project Pandora, Project Squid, and a dozen other programs that were supposedly terminated decades ago." She spread the papers across the table. Camden could see frequency charts, psychological assessment reports, and what looked like operational summaries written in the dense, bureaucratic language of classified military documents. The basic principle is simple, Nia continued. Certain electromagnetic frequencies can influence human brain activity. Low-frequency waves can induce anxiety, depression, or aggressive behaviour. Higher frequencies can cause disorientation, memory problems, or even hallucinations. The military has been researching this for decades. But that's individual psychology, Camden said. What does that have to do with weather modification? Because it's not just about the weather, Camden. It's about controlling populations through environmental manipulation. You make people uncomfortable with changes in atmospheric pressure. You make them agitated with subsonic frequencies. And you make them desperate by destroying their crops or their infrastructure. Then you give them a target for their anger. Camden stared at the documents. You're talking about mass mind control. I'm talking about a technology that can trigger natural disasters in strategically chosen locations, while simultaneously priming the affected populations for specific behavioural responses. Imagine being able to cause an earthquake in a politically unstable region, while broadcasting frequencies that increase the likelihood of violent uprising, or creating drought conditions while transmitting signals that make people more susceptible to authoritarian messaging. Camden struggled to find words. That's monstrous. That's Signal 88K, Nia said quietly, and if I'm right about the pattern, the next transmission is in 3 days. She was right. On March 15th, 2026, at exactly 11:42 GMT, Camden's monitoring equipment detected the familiar high-frequency pulse emanating from the direction of Gakona, but this time he and Nia were prepared. Using equipment borrowed from Nia's contacts in the electronic surveillance community, they had set up a triangulation array to precisely locate the source of the transmission. The signal wasn't coming from the main HAARP facility, which was supposedly shut down for maintenance. It was coming from a smaller installation about 5 miles southeast, hidden in a valley that didn't appear on any public maps. Within hours of the transmission, news reports began flooding in. A sudden hailstorm had devastated agricultural regions in Argentina, while simultaneously anti-government protests had erupted in 3 separate South American capitals. The protesters all reported feeling unusually agitated and angry, unable to explain the intensity of their emotions. Camden and Nia looked at each other across their makeshift monitoring station. They both knew they had crossed a line from speculation into dangerous territory. They weren't just tracking an unusual signal anymore. They were documenting evidence of what could only be described as a crime against humanity. We need more information, Nia said. We need to know who's behind this and what their ultimate goal is. How do we do that? We need to find someone on the inside, someone who knows about the real purpose of these installations. She pulled out a satellite phone that looked military surplus. I think I know someone who might be able to help us. The drive to Barrow took them through some of the most desolate landscape Camden had ever seen. Snow-covered tundra stretched to the horizon in every direction, broken only by the occasional cluster of buildings or abandoned industrial structure. It was the kind of place where secrets could be buried and forgotten, where people could disappear without anyone asking too many questions. Nia had been cryptic about their contact, referring to him only as Valence, and explaining that he was a former technician who had worked on classified atmospheric research projects in the 1990s. He had reached out to her through encrypted channels after reading some of her early articles about electromagnetic behavioural modification. He's paranoid, but he has good reason to be, Nia explained as they drove through the endless white landscape. 3 of his former colleagues have died in the past 5 years. Car accidents, heart attacks, a hunting mishap. All men in their 40s and 50s with no history of health problems. You think they were killed? I think they knew something that certain people didn't want them to know. They met Valence at an abandoned weather station 20 miles outside Barrow. He was a lean man with prematurely white hair and the kind of 1,000-yard stare that Camden associated with people who had seen too much. He arrived in a battered pickup truck and insisted on checking both Camden and Nia for electronic devices before he would speak to them. "I've been following your work, Doctor. LaForge," he said once he was satisfied they weren't recording the conversation. You're closer to the truth than you know, and that makes you more dangerous than you realise." "What truth?" Camden asked. Valance studied him for a long moment. The truth about what HAARP really is, about what it was always designed to do. He walked to the back of his truck and retrieved a metal box that looked like it had been sealed with military-grade locks. "I brought you something, but once you see this, there's no going back. Are you sure you want to know?" Camden and Nia exchanged glances. They had already gone too far to turn back now. The box contained magnetic tapes, dozens of them, each labelled with cryptic alphanumeric codes. But 3 of them were different, marked with a designation Camden had never seen before. SYBIL-Tier 3. "Project SYBIL, Valance said, his voice barely above a whisper. Officially, it never existed. It was a joint project between DARPA, the CIA, and a private defense contractor called DIST, Department of Interference and Signal Telemetry. The goal was to develop what they called environmental shaping for strategic advantages. He helped them load the tapes into a portable player he had brought. The first tape contained acoustic blueprints, detailed technical drawings showing how specific radio frequencies could be used to modify weather patterns. But these weren't just about creating storms or droughts. They were about creating precise psychological conditions in human populations. "Look at this," Valance said, pointing to a diagram that showed electromagnetic field patterns overlaid on a map of Central America. This was a test run in 1987. They used ionospheric heating to create pressure differentials that caused widespread insomnia in Guatemala City, right before a planned military coup. Sleep-deprived people are more susceptible to authority figures and less likely to question official narratives. The second tape was even more disturbing. It contained operational records from what appeared to be field tests of the technology. Camden saw references to mood suppression fields, tested in various locations around the world, disguised as natural weather phenomena. Operation Telluric, Valance explained. That was the code name for a series of experiments conducted between 2018 and 2020. They tested focused electromagnetic fields in major South American cities, fields designed to induce specific emotional states: anxiety, depression, aggression, compliance. They could dial it up or down like adjusting the volume on a radio. "How is that possible?" Camden asked. "The human brain operates on electromagnetic principles. Every thought, every emotion, every decision involves electrical impulses travelling through neural networks. If you can broadcast the right frequencies at the right intensity, you can influence those neural networks from a distance." The third tape was the most terrifying of all. It contained maps showing the locations of dozens of similar installations around the world, a global network of ionospheric manipulation stations that could coordinate their activities to affect weather and human behaviour on a massive scale. HAARP in Alaska is just one node, Valance said. There's another installation in Tromsø, Norway, disguised as an Aurora research station. There's a decommissioned radar dome in Western Australia that was retrofitted with ionospheric heating equipment. And there's a facility built into an abandoned oil rig off the coast of Nova Scotia. Camden studied the maps. The installations were positioned to provide coverage of every major population centre on Earth. If they were coordinating their activities, they could potentially influence weather patterns and human behaviour across entire continents. "Who controls all this?" Nia asked. "That's the question I've been trying to answer for 20 years, Valance replied. DIST was supposedly dissolved in 1994, but the technology was transferred to other agencies. Some of it went to the military, some to the intelligence community, and some to private contractors who work for whoever pays them." He pulled out a final document, a personnel roster that looked like it had been copied from an internal government database. Camden recognised some of the names: atmospheric scientists, electromagnetic researchers, military officers, but one name stood out: Dr. Amanda Trask, listed as Director of Operations for DIST. Trask was the one who developed the original psychological targeting protocols, Valance explained. She figured out how to use ionospheric heating not just to modify weather, but to modify human behaviour on a mass scale. After DIST was officially disbanded, she disappeared from public view, but I have reason to believe she's still involved in the project. "Where is she now?" Camden asked. That's what you need to find out, because if Sybil is still operational, and if someone is using it to manipulate global events, then Trask is probably the key to understanding how it all works. Camden and Nia spent the next 3 hours going through the tapes, copying as much information as they could onto encrypted drives. The picture that emerged was of a decades-long project to develop the ultimate weapon of social control, a technology that could shape human civilization itself by manipulating the very environment people lived in. As they prepared to leave, Valance grabbed Camden's arm. "Be careful who you trust. Sybil isn't just a research project anymore. It's an operational system, and there are people who will kill to protect it. My former colleagues learned that the hard way." "Why are you helping us?" Nia asked. Valance was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the frozen landscape. "Because I helped build it. I spent years thinking I was working on defensive weather modification, ways to protect American cities from hurricanes and tornadoes. I didn't realize until it was too late that we were building something that could be used to control entire populations." He looked back at them. "I can't undo what I helped create, but maybe I can help you stop it." As they drove back toward Fairbanks, Camden couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The empty tundra suddenly seemed full of hidden observers, and every vehicle they passed felt like a potential threat. "What do we do now?" he asked Nia. "Now we find Dr. Amanda Trask," she replied, "and we find out who's really running Sybil." Dr. Amanda Trask had not been easy to find. In fact, according to every official record Camden and Nia could access, she had died in a car accident in 1998, 7 years before HAARP had even become fully operational. But Valance had been certain she was still alive, and after 2 weeks of digging through military contractor databases and cross-referencing personnel transfers, they had found traces of her. A consulting contract with a company called Atmospheric Dynamics International, a research paper on ionospheric manipulation published under a pseudonym, a patent application for electromagnetic behavioural modification systems filed through a shell corporation. The trail led them to a small town in Montana, where ADI maintained what appeared to be a modest research facility. From the outside, it looked like any other corporate office building, complete with a parking lot full of sensible sedans and a sign advertising environmental consulting services. But Nia's electromagnetic detection equipment was going crazy. "There's a massive transmitter array somewhere on this property," she said, studying the readings on her portable scanner. "The electromagnetic signature is off the charts." They had parked on a hill overlooking the facility, using binoculars to observe the comings and goings of personnel. Most of the people entering and leaving the building looked like typical office workers, but Camden noticed that many of them wore ID badges with unusual security features, the kind of high-tech identification used by defence contractors working on classified projects. "There," Nia said, pointing toward the building's entrance, "the woman in the grey suit." Camden adjusted his binoculars and focused on the figure Nia had indicated. She was probably in her 60s, with silver hair and the kind of purposeful stride that suggested authority. Even from a distance, there was something about her bearing that commanded attention. "You think that's Trask?" "I think that's someone who knows about Trask. Look at how the other personnel defer to her." They watched as the woman in grey entered the building, followed by 2 men in dark suits who had the unmistakable bearing of security operatives. Whatever was happening inside that facility, it was clearly more important than environmental consulting. That night, Camden made a decision that would have seemed impossible to him just months earlier. He was going to break into a classified government facility. "This is insane," Nia said as they prepared their equipment. "If we get caught, we're not just talking about criminal charges. People who interfere with projects like this have a tendency to disappear." "People are already disappearing," Camden replied. "Valance's colleagues, probably others who got too close to the truth. How many more will die if we don't find out what Sybil is really doing?" They waited until 3 a.m. when the facility appeared to be minimally staffed. Nia's experience with electronic surveillance had taught her how to bypass most commercial security systems, and the ADI building used surprisingly conventional technology for a facility that housed such advanced research. The first floor was exactly what Camden had expected. offices, conference rooms and reception areas that could have belonged to any consulting firm. But the elevator required a special keycard to access the lower levels, and that's where they knew the real work was being done. Nia produced a device that looked like a cross between a smartphone and a circuit board. Electronic lock picker, she explained. NSA surplus. Within minutes she had the elevator operating. The basement level was a completely different world. Instead of corporate offices, they found laboratories filled with electromagnetic transmission equipment, banks of computers running atmospheric modelling software, and walls covered with global weather maps marked with cryptic notations. "Jesus," Camden whispered as he studied one of the maps. Red pins marked locations around the world, each one corresponding to a date and a brief description. Jakarta flooding, March 3rd, Australian bushfires, March 10th, tornado outbreak in Oklahoma, March 17th. "They're not predicting these events," Nia said, reading over his shoulder. "They're planning them." The laboratory's computer system was secured, but Nia had brought tools for that as well. While she worked on accessing the electronic files, Camden explored the physical documents left scattered around various workstations. What he found confirmed their worst fears. Sibyl wasn't just a research project or even a weapon system. It was an ongoing operation designed to reshape global political and economic conditions through controlled environmental manipulation. The documents described a concept called environmental statecraft, the use of weather modification and electromagnetic behavioural influence to achieve strategic objectives without conventional military intervention. Need to destabilise a hostile government, create drought conditions that lead to food shortages and civil unrest, want to influence an election, use subsonic frequencies to increase anxiety levels in specific demographic groups. "Camden, you need to see this," Nia called from the computer terminal. She had managed to access what appeared to be an operational database, showing real-time status reports from installations around the world. The HAARP facility in Alaska was just one part of a global network that was actively manipulating weather patterns and human behaviour on every continent. The installation in Norway was currently generating low-pressure systems designed to increase depression rates in Scandinavia. The Australian facility was creating electromagnetic fields intended to suppress cognitive function in major urban areas. The Nova Scotia rig was broadcasting frequencies calibrated to increase aggression levels in the eastern United States. It's not random, Camden realised as he studied the data. There's a pattern. They're trying to destabilise democratic institutions by making populations more susceptible to authoritarian messaging. "Look at this," Nia said, pointing to a scheduling system that showed planned operations for the next 6 months. They're planning to coordinate a massive operation during the next US election cycle. Atmospheric pressure manipulation to increase anxiety, electromagnetic fields to impair critical thinking, and targeted weather events to create chaos in key swing states. Camden felt sick. They weren't just documenting a conspiracy theory anymore. They were looking at evidence of an active plot to undermine democratic processes on a global scale. "We need to copy everything," he said. "Every file, every document, every piece of evidence we can find." But as Nia began downloading data from the system, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Emergency lighting bathed the laboratory in pulsing red light, and they could hear the sound of heavy footsteps approaching from the stairwell. "Time to go," Nia said, grabbing the portable drives containing the downloaded data. They made it to the elevator just as the first security operatives reached the basement level. Camden caught a glimpse of men in tactical gear carrying weapons that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie rather than a corporate security force. The elevator ride to the ground floor felt like it took forever, but they made it to the parking garage without being spotted. Camden's hands were shaking as he started the car, and he could see in the rearview mirror that the entire facility was now flooded with light, as security teams searched for the intruders. They were 3 miles away when Nia finally spoke. "Did you see the signature on those operational orders?" Camden shook his head, focused on putting as much distance as possible between them and the ADI facility. "A. Trask, DISC director. She's not dead, Camden. She's still running the program." As they drove through the Montana darkness, Camden realised that they had stumbled onto something far bigger than weather modification or even mind control. They had uncovered evidence of a shadow organisation that was actively reshaping human civilization itself, using the planet's own atmospheric systems as tools of social control. And somewhere out there, Dr. Amanda Trask was orchestrating it all. The safe house was a cabin in the Cascade Mountains, far enough from any major city to be off most surveillance grids, but close enough to Seattle to maintain internet connectivity. Nia had arranged it through contacts in the digital privacy community, people who understood the importance of staying invisible when powerful interests wanted you found. Camden had spent the past week analysing the data they had stolen from the ADI facility, and the picture that emerged was even more terrifying than he had imagined. Sybil wasn't just an experimental program, it was a fully operational system for global social control that had been active for over a decade. "Look at this correlation," he said, pointing to a chart he had created showing electromagnetic transmissions from HAARP installations plotted against major world events. Every significant political upheaval in the past 5 years corresponds to a period of increased ionospheric heating activity. The Arab Spring, Brexit, the rise of populist movements across Europe and South America, political polarization in the United States. All of it had been preceded by specific patterns of electromagnetic transmission designed to influence human behaviour on a mass scale. "They're not just responding to world events," Nia said. "They're creating them." The most disturbing revelation was the scope of the operation. The documents they had recovered showed that Sybil had evolved far beyond its original Cold War mission of targeting enemy populations. It was now being used to influence domestic politics in dozens of countries, including the United States. The American people are being subjected to the same psychological manipulation techniques that were originally developed for warfare, Camden said. Our own government is treating its citizens as enemy combatants. But the question that haunted both of them was who was ultimately controlling the system. The operational orders they had seen were signed by Amanda Trask, but Trask was officially a private contractor. Someone higher up the chain of command was making the strategic decisions about when and where to deploy Sybil's capabilities. The answer came in the form of an encrypted message that appeared on Nia's secure communication system 3 days later. The sender identified himself only as Valance, but the message contained information that could only have come from someone with high-level access to classified systems. Sybil operational control has been transferred to a joint task force based at CIA headquarters in Langley, the message read. Primary coordination through a unit designated as Climate Operations Division. Recommend immediate investigation of signal routing from HAARP installations to determine central command structure. He wants us to trace the signals back to their source, Nia said. That means going back to Alaska, Camden replied, to the HAARP facility itself. The journey back to Alaska felt different this time. Camden and Nia were no longer curious researchers investigating anomalous weather patterns. They were fugitives from a shadow war being fought with invisible weapons, carrying information that could expose one of the most dangerous programs in human history. They approached the HAARP facility during a solar minimum, when natural electromagnetic activity would be at its lowest point. This would make any artificial signal stand out clearly against the background noise of the ionosphere. The main HAARP installation consisted of 180 antennas arranged in a grid pattern across several acres of Alaskan wilderness. Officially, it was operated by the University of Alaska for Atmospheric Research, but Camden now knew that was merely a cover for much more sinister activities. Using equipment borrowed from Nia's network of electronic surveillance experts, they set up a signal analysis station on a hillside overlooking the facility. The plan was simple in concept but dangerous in execution. They would monitor HAARP's transmissions and trace the routing of any signals that didn't match the facility's published research activities. The first night of observation yielded nothing unusual. HAARP appeared to be conducting routine ionospheric heating experiments, the kind of legitimate research that had provided cover for the facility's true purpose for decades. But on the second night, everything changed. At exactly 11:47 p.m. local time, the antenna array began transmitting signal 88K. Camden and Nia watched their monitoring equipment register the familiar high-frequency pulse pattern, but this time they were prepared to trace its destination. It's not staying in the ionosphere. Hello there, night wanderers and truth seekers. Before we dive into tonight's story, I'm curious. How has your day been treating you? What time is it where you're listening from, and what corner of this vast world do you call home? Whether you're lying in bed in London at midnight, driving through the American Midwest at dawn, or taking a lunch break in Tokyo, you found your way to Sleep Theories, where the darkness reveals truths that daylight tends to hide. If you're new here, welcome to our community of insomniacs, investigators, and anyone brave enough to question the official narrative. Don't forget to subscribe to Sleep Theories. We're building something special together, one sleepless night at a time. Tonight's story isn't just another conspiracy theory. It's about a plane that vanished not because it crashed, but because it knew too much. And 10 years later, one quiet engineer discovered why the world was never meant to find it. So settle in, dim those lights, and let me tell you about Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, and the man who uncovered what really happened on that March night in 2014. March 8th, 2014. Kuala Lumpur International Airport hummed with its usual late-night energy. Gate C1 buzzed with travellers heading to Beijing, business executives clutching leather briefcases, families returning home, students with oversized backpacks. Among them were people whose names would never make headlines, but whose presence on that flight would change everything. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah performed his final pre-flight checks on the Boeing 777-200ER. At 53, he was an experienced pilot with over 18,000 flight hours. His co-pilot, 27-year-old Farik Abdul Hamid, was younger but equally competent. Together they would be responsible for 239 souls on what should have been a routine 6-hour flight to China's capital. At 12:41 a.m. local time, Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 pushed back from the gate. The aircraft, registration 9 MMRO, taxied through the humid Malaysian night air toward runway 32R. In the passenger cabin, people settled in for the red-eye flight. Some already dozed, others scrolled through phones before takeoff, a few nervously gripped armrests. Flying still made them anxious despite the statistics. What none of them knew was that their aircraft was carrying more than just passengers and their belongings. Deep in the cargo hold, secured according to international aviation protocols, sat several containers marked as radio equipment. The manifest listed the contents as standard electronics, but the weight discrepancies had caught the attention of exactly no one who mattered. After all, paperwork errors happened all the time in international shipping. At 12:42 a.m, MH370 received clearance for takeoff. The twin Rolls-Royce engines spooled up, and the massive aircraft began its roll down the runway. Seconds later, it lifted into the warm South China Sea air, climbing toward its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The lights of Kuala Lumpur fell away below as the plane turned northeast toward Vietnam airspace. For the next 37 minutes, everything proceeded normally. The aircraft followed its designated route, maintaining regular radio contact with air traffic control. Passengers settled into sleep or entertainment systems. Flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, offering beverages and checking on passenger needs. At 1:07 a.m, as MH370 crossed into Vietnamese airspace, Captain Zahari made routine contact with Kuala Lumpur ATC, Malaysian 370, maintaining flight level 350. His voice was calm, professional, betraying nothing unusual. 12 minutes later, at 1:19 a.m, came the final transmission that the world would hear. "Good night, Malaysian 370. The voice was relaxed, almost casual. Controllers assumed it was Captain Zahari, though later analysis would raise questions about the speaker's identity. Those 4 words would be dissected by investigators for years to come, searched for hidden meanings, stress indicators, coded messages, but in that moment they seemed utterly routine. 2 minutes after that final transmission, something extraordinary happened. The aircraft's transponder, the device that broadcasts the plane's identity, altitude and position-to-radar systems went silent. Modern commercial aircraft don't simply lose their transponders. The system has multiple redundancies, backup power supplies, and is designed to continue operating even during significant electrical failures. But MH370's transponder didn't fail, it was turned off. What happened next defied everything aviation experts thought they knew about aircraft behaviour. Instead of continuing northeast toward Beijing, MH370 made a sharp left turn. The massive Boeing 777 banked west, then northwest, flying back across the Malay Peninsula. It was as if the aircraft had suddenly developed its own agenda. Malaysian military radar, which unlike civilian radar can track aircraft without transponder signals, detected the aircraft crossing back over Malaysia. The plane flew over Penang, Captain Zahari's hometown, at approximately 1:52 a.m. It maintained a steady altitude and speed, suggesting someone was still very much in control of the aircraft. But here's where the official story becomes murky. Malaysian military controllers, watching this unidentified aircraft cross their airspace in the middle of the night, assumed it was a friendly military flight that had forgotten to coordinate with civilian air traffic control. They made no attempt to intercept or identify the aircraft. In post-9/11 aviation security, this level of assumption was either incompetent or deliberate. The last confirmed radar contact with MH370 came at 2:22 a.m, when the aircraft was detected northwest of Penang Island, flying toward the Andaman Sea. After that, the plane vanished from conventional radar coverage, but satellites don't lie, and they don't sleep. The Inmarsat satellite network, a British-operated constellation providing global communications coverage, continued to receive automated handshake signals from MH370's satellite communication system. These weren't voice communications or data transmissions. They were the digital equivalent of a heartbeat, confirming that the aircraft's systems were still powered and attempting to maintain connection. These satellite pings would continue for another 6 hours, until 8:11 a.m. Malaysian time. By analysing the Doppler shift in these signals, the same phenomenon that makes an ambulance siren change pitch as it passes, investigators determined that MH370 had flown south into the Indian Ocean. The official conclusion became gospel. MH370, for reasons unknown, had flown on autopilot until fuel exhaustion, then crashed somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean. It was a tragedy, a mystery, but ultimately an accident. The largest and most expensive search operation in aviation history began. Ships and aircraft from multiple nations scoured 120,000 square kilometres of ocean. Families grieved, experts theorised, conspiracy theorists speculated, and gradually the world moved on to other crises and mysteries. But some people never stopped asking questions, and 10 years later, one of those people would discover that everything the world had been told about MH370 was a carefully constructed lie. Toulouse, France, October 2024. Émile Charvet had always been drawn to patterns others missed. As a senior avionics software architect for Thales Group, one of Europe's largest defence contractors, he specialised in satellite communication protocols for military-grade tracking systems. His basement office in the company's sprawling facility looked like something between a NASA mission control room and a hacker's den. Multiple monitors displaying cascading data streams, whiteboards covered in equations, and towers of technical manuals that seemed to defy gravity. At 42, Émile was the kind of engineer who read technical specifications for relaxation and found poetry in elegant code. His colleagues respected his expertise, but often found his obsessive attention to detail exhausting. Émile didn't mind their distance. He preferred the company of data to people anyway. That October morning, Émile was testing new compression algorithms for military satellite tracking when his supervisor dropped an unusual request on his desk. The European Space Agency wanted Thales to review historical satellite data for potential improvements to their tracking protocols. As a test case, they'd provided 10 years' worth of archived Inmarsat logs, including data from several high-profile aviation incidents. Just run the standard analysis, his supervisor had said. Look for inefficiencies in the ping protocols, compression ratios, that sort of thing. Should be straightforward. Emil nodded and accepted the assignment, but straightforward wasn't in his vocabulary. As he loaded the historical data into his analysis software, one dataset immediately caught his attention: the MH370 satellite logs. He'd followed the case peripherally when it happened, like most people around the world. A plane vanishes. Massive search. No definitive answers. Tragic, but not unusual in the grand scheme of aviation accidents. But now, looking at the raw satellite data through the lens of his specialised knowledge, Emil began to see discrepancies that troubled him. The first anomaly was subtle. Tiny variations in the ping timing that were inconsistent with the official flight path analysis. Inmarsat had concluded that MH370 flew south based on Doppler shift calculations, but Emil's analysis suggested something different. The timing variations indicated periods where the aircraft's satellite communication system was cycling between different signal states, almost as if it was being jammed and then allowed to reconnect. Emil spent the next 3 days diving deeper into the data. He cross-referenced the MH370 pings with other aircraft communications from the same time period, looking for patterns. What he found made him question everything he thought he knew about the case. The satellite logs showed clear evidence of signal ghosting, a signature that occurred when aircraft communications were being intercepted and rebroadcast by sophisticated electronic warfare systems. It was a technique Emil knew well from his work on military projects, but seeing it in civilian aviation data was unprecedented. Signal ghosting required military-grade equipment and expertise. It wasn't something that could be accomplished by hijackers or suicidal pilots. This was the work of a nation-state with advanced electronic warfare capabilities. Emil began mapping the ghosted signals against known military installations in the Indian Ocean region. The pattern that emerged was chilling. The signal trail, when properly decoded, didn't point toward the southern Indian Ocean crash site that had been the focus of the massive search operation. It pointed toward Diego Garcia. Diego Garcia was a small atoll in the British Indian Ocean Territory that housed one of America's most strategic military bases. The island, leased to the United States by Britain, served as a launching point for military operations across the Middle East and Asia. It was also one of the most secretive installations in the US military network, with access strictly controlled and media coverage virtually non-existent. Emil stared at his analysis results for a long time. If he was right, if the signal ghosting was real, then MH370 hadn't crashed in the southern Indian Ocean. It had been electronically hijacked and directed to a US military base. But why? What could possibly justify such an operation? Emil began researching the passenger manifest, looking for anyone who might have been of interest to intelligence agencies. Most of the passengers seemed ordinary: families, business travellers, tourists. But as he dug deeper, several names began to stand out. Dr. Li Junhao, a Chinese national working for a defence contractor specialising in quantum encryption technology. According to his LinkedIn profile, which had been deleted shortly after the plane's disappearance, Dr. Li held several patents related to quantum communication systems that could theoretically make military communications unhackable. Even more intriguing were the 20 employees of Freescale Semiconductor who were aboard the flight. Freescale was a major supplier of electronic components to the defence industry, and these particular employees were involved in developing advanced radar and communication systems. They were travelling to Beijing to meet with potential Chinese partners about technology licensing deals. Emil's engineering mind began connecting the dots. In 2014, tensions between the United States and China over technology transfer and cyber warfare were escalating. The Obama administration had been increasingly concerned about Chinese acquisition of sensitive American technologies, particularly in the defence and aerospace sectors. If the cargo manifest's radio equipment actually contained prototype technology, if Dr. Li was carrying quantum encryption research, if the Freescale employees were about to share advanced radar technology with Chinese partners, suddenly MH370 became much more than a passenger flight. It became a national security threat. But Emil knew he needed more evidence before he could take his theory seriously, let alone share it with anyone else. Signal ghosting could have other explanations. The passenger connections might be coincidental. He needed proof. That proof came from an unexpected source. Emil's investigation might have ended there, with theories and suspicions but no concrete evidence, if not for a message that appeared in his encrypted email one November morning. The sender identified himself only as Sundown, and the message was brief. "I understand you've been asking questions about Malaysian 370. Meet me in the archives." The archives referred to a secure peer-to-peer forum used by aviation professionals to share technical information and occasionally sensitive industry gossip. Emil had been a member for years but rarely posted. Somehow, Sundown knew about his research. When Emil logged into the forum that evening, he found a private message waiting for him. Attached were several files, encrypted with military-grade security. The decryption key came in a separate message. The plane never crashed. They're still out there. Emil's hands shook as he decrypted the files. What he found was a trove of classified documents that painted a picture far more complex and disturbing than his signal analysis had suggested. The first document was a partial transcript of communications between Malaysian Air Traffic Control and an unidentified military aircraft on the night of March 8th, 2014. The timestamps corresponded exactly with MH370's disappearance. Malaysian ATC to unidentified military. We show a civilian aircraft in your vicinity. No transponder signal. Unidentified military to Malaysian ATC. Negative on civilian traffic. We are conducting authorized exercises. Malaysian ATC. Roger. Malaysian 370 is no longer on our scope. Unidentified military. Understood. Continuing exercise protocols. The second document was even more revealing, a fragment of what appeared to be a US Air Force debriefing report. Most of the text was redacted, but several paragraphs remained readable. Operation Nightshade proceeded according to protocol. Asset MH370 was successfully diverted using electronic warfare countermeasures. Cargo recovery was completed at 0347 local time. Passenger processing initiated per previous authorizations. Technology packages recovered included quantum encryption prototypes, Lee container, advanced radar components, Freescale shipment, unspecified electronics, container 7A, weight discrepancy noted. Asset disposition, recommend standard maritime protocols for wreckage distribution. Southern Indian Ocean provides adequate depth for permanent concealment. Emil read the document 3 times before its implications fully sank in. If this was real, MH370 hadn't been hijacked by terrorists or crashed due to pilot suicide. It had been intercepted by the US military as part of a planned operation to prevent sensitive technology from reaching China. But what about the passengers? What did passenger processing mean? The third document provided a chilling answer. It was a medical manifest from Diego Garcia dated March 9th, 2014, one day after MH370's disappearance. The document listed 239 individuals receiving emergency medical evaluation following an aircraft emergency. Most of the names were redacted, but several remained visible, including Dr. Lee Jun-hao and 5 of the Freescale engineers. Next to each name was a medical status code. Emil looked up the military medical codes online. Most indicated transferred to secondary facility. But 5 names, including Dr. Lee, were marked Decon 7, a code Emil couldn't find in any public military manual. The final document was the most disturbing of all. It was a brief memo from someone identified only as CENTCOM-3 to NRO-Pacific. Nightshade assets have been processed according to protocol. Technology packages secured and transferred to appropriate research facilities. Human assets have been integrated into ongoing intelligence operations where applicable. Recommend continuation of civilian search operations to maintain operational security. Debris placement will commence per attached schedule to support official narrative. All personnel involved in Nightshade operations have been briefed on classification requirements. Any unauthorized disclosure will be handled according to existing protocols. Emil sat in his dark office staring at the documents on his screen. If they were authentic, they described not just the interception of a civilian aircraft, but the kidnapping and possible murder of 239 innocent people to prevent technology transfer to China. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe the documents were fake, created by conspiracy theorists or foreign intelligence services trying to embarrass the United States. Maybe his signal analysis was wrong. Maybe there was an innocent explanation for everything. But deep down, Emil knew he was looking at the truth. The next morning he received another message from Sundown. "Meet me tonight. You need to see the rest." The meeting location was a small cafe in Toulouse's old quarter, far from the aerospace industry facilities where anyone might recognise Emil. He arrived early, nursing a coffee and watching the door with a paranoia that had been growing since he'd first seen Sundown's documents. The man who approached his table looked nothing like Emil had expected. Mid-50s, grey hair, wearing a worn leather jacket and carrying a newspaper like a tourist. He could have been anyone. A retired teacher, a shop owner, someone's grandfather. Only his eyes gave him away. They were the careful, watchful eyes of someone who had lived with dangerous secrets. "You're Charvet," the man said, sitting down without invitation. "I'm Robert. That's not my real name, but it'll do." Emil nodded. "Sundown, I assume." "I was a communications officer with the RAF, stationed at various places you've never heard of, doing things I can't discuss. Officially I retired in 2016. Unofficially, some of us never really retire from the work." Robert ordered coffee and studied Emil carefully. "You've seen the documents. What do you think?" "I think they're either the most elaborate fake in history, or they describe a war crime," Emil replied. "No fake. I was part of the communication network that night. Not directly involved in the operation, but I saw the traffic, heard the radio chatter, watched a civilian airliner disappear from the world's radar screens because someone decided the cargo it was carrying was too valuable to let China have." Robert reached into his jacket and pulled out a small USB drive. "This contains everything I could safely extract before I left the service. Communication logs, operational summaries, follow-up reports. You won't like what you see." Emil pocketed the drive. "Why are you giving this to me? Why not take it to journalists or WikiLeaks or someone who can actually do something with it?" "Because journalists can be discredited and WikiLeaks is compromised. But you're an engineer. You understand systems, data, proof, and you found the signal ghosting on your own, which means you're smart enough to validate what I'm giving you." Robert leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Do you know what happened to the lead investigators on the official MH370 search? The ones who were asking the right questions?" Emil shook his head. "Captain Kok Soo Chon, Malaysian military radar specialist. Found dead in his apartment in Kuala Lumpur, apparent heart attack 3 months after the disappearance. He was 34 years old, no history of heart problems. Sarah Bates, partner of one of the American passengers. She was pushing for independent investigation of the satellite data. Car accident in Beijing, 2015. Dr. Victor Ianello, independent aviation analyst who questioned the official flight path. House fire in Virginia, 2016. He survived, but all his research was destroyed. Marc Dugan, French author investigating the Diego Garcia connection. Death threats forced him to stop his research and leave France. There are others. Anyone who got too close to the truth found their lives suddenly complicated or ended. Emil felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. "And you think I'm next?" "I think you're asking the right questions, and that makes you dangerous to people who have killed to keep this secret. But you also have something the others didn't. Technical expertise they can't easily discredit and access to systems they can't easily monitor." Robert stood to leave, then paused. "There's something else. The families of the passengers, they deserve to know. Some of those people might still be alive." "Still alive?" The document suggested they were processed, but I assumed that meant... I don't know what it meant, but 5 years after MH370 disappeared, I intercepted communications mentioning Nightshade assets being transferred to a research facility in Nevada. Asset numbers matched passenger manifest positions. With that, Robert walked away, leaving Emil alone with his coffee and a USB drive that contained enough evidence to topple governments or get him killed. That night, Emil went through the new files methodically. The picture they painted was even darker than he'd imagined. The operation to intercept MH370 had been planned weeks in advance, triggered by intelligence about the technology transfer meeting in Beijing. The Pentagon had decided that the quantum encryption research and advanced radar components aboard the flight represented an unacceptable risk to US national security. MH370 had been electronically hijacked using technology Emil recognised from his work with Thales, advanced electronic warfare systems capable of overriding aircraft communications and navigation systems. The plane had been directed to land at Diego Garcia under the pretense of a medical emergency. Once on the ground, the passengers had been detained while the cargo was secured. The technology packages were transferred to American research facilities, where engineers began reverse engineering the Chinese quantum encryption work and Freescale's advanced radar components. But what about the passengers? The files suggested that some, particularly those with technical expertise, had been offered a choice: cooperation in exchange for new identities and comfortable lives in US protection, or indefinite detention as enemy assets. Dr. Li Junhao, according to one heavily redacted report, had initially refused to cooperate, but after months of interrogation and psychological pressure, he had begun working with American researchers on quantum communication systems. His family in China believed he was dead, killed in an airline accident. The Freescale engineers had been split up and assigned to different research programs across the United States. Their expertise in advanced radar systems was being used to develop countermeasures against Chinese military technology. Other passengers with no strategic value had been held at a detention facility on Diego Garcia, then gradually transferred to other locations. Some had been given new identities and relocated to remote areas of the United States or its allies, with the understanding that any attempt to contact their families would result in their disappearance. The most chilling document in the collection was a psychological evaluation report on several passengers, noting their adaptation to their new circumstances and their likelihood of maintaining operational security. It read like a livestock assessment. As for the official search operation, it had been an elaborate piece of theatre designed to give the appearance of international cooperation while ensuring that the wreckage would never be found. The debris that had washed up on various shores was real. Pieces of MH370 that had been deliberately scattered by military submarines to support the crash narrative. Emil worked through the night, cross-referencing the new documents with his signal analysis and the files Sundown had originally provided. Everything fit together with the terrible precision of a well-planned operation. By dawn, he had compiled enough evidence to prove that MH370 had been the target of a military operation that had resulted in the kidnapping and possible murder of 239 innocent people. The question now was what to do with that knowledge. Emil spent the next 2 weeks carefully planning his revelation. He knew that simply releasing the documents wouldn't be enough. They could be dismissed as forgeries, and he could be discredited as a conspiracy theorist or foreign agent. He needed to present the evidence in a way that would be impossible to ignore or debunk. Using his access to Thales systems, he compiled a comprehensive technical analysis that combined his signal ghosting discoveries with the classified documents. He created multiple copies of everything, stored on various secure servers and encrypted with quantum-level security protocols. If someone wanted to suppress his revelations, they would have to find and destroy dozens of separate data caches around the world. He also prepared a detailed video presentation explaining his findings, recorded in his home office with multiple camera angles and technical displays. The video included not just his analysis, but step-by-step instructions for other engineers to verify his work using publicly available satellite data. On December 15th, 2024, exactly 10 years and 9 months after MH370's disappearance, Emil uploaded everything to a dozen different platforms simultaneously. The main upload went to a secure peer-to-peer network used by aviation professionals, but copies also appeared on encrypted forums, academic data repositories, and even mainstream social media platforms. The response was immediate and explosive. Within hours, the video had been viewed millions of times. Aviation experts began downloading the satellite data and confirming Emil's signal analysis. journalists started investigating the passenger connections he'd identified. Families of MH370 victims, who had spent a decade demanding answers, seized on the revelations as validation of their suspicions. But the pushback came just as quickly. Thaley's group immediately placed Emil on administrative leave, claiming his unauthorized use of company systems violated security protocols. Government officials in both the United States and Malaysia denounced the revelations as dangerous conspiracy theories and suggested that Emil might be working for foreign intelligence services. Social media platforms began removing copies of his video, citing misinformation policies. Mainstream news outlets initially ignored the story, then published articles questioning Emil's credentials and mental state. But the internet had learned to root around censorship, and Emil's evidence continued to spread. Independent verification of his signal analysis began appearing from aviation experts around the world. Former intelligence officers started coming forward with their own pieces of the puzzle. 3 days after his initial release, Emil returned to his apartment in Toulouse to find his door broken and his home ransacked. His computers were gone, along with his backup drives and even his personal photographs. Whoever had searched the place had been thorough and professional. More disturbing was what they had left behind. His cat, Marcel, a 16-year-old tabby who had been his companion since his university days, was lying dead in the kitchen. There were no obvious injuries, but the animal's position suggested he had died in pain. The message was clear. They could reach him anywhere, any time. Emil packed a single bag and left Toulouse that night. He drove to a small hotel in the Pyrenees, paying cash and using false identification he had prepared weeks earlier. From there, he uploaded one final video to the secure networks. The video showed him sitting in the anonymous hotel room, unshaven and exhausted but still determined. He spoke directly to the camera. "My name is Emil Charvet. I'm a French avionics engineer, and 3 days ago I revealed evidence that Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 was intercepted by the United States military to prevent sensitive technology from reaching China. Since then, my employer has disavowed me, my government has questioned my sanity, and unknown individuals have killed my cat and destroyed my home. I want to be clear about something. I never expected to be believed immediately. I never expected this to be easy. Powerful people have invested 10 years and billions of dollars in maintaining the lie that MH370 crashed in the Indian Ocean. They will not abandon that lie without a fight. But I also want to be clear about this. Everything I have revealed is true. The satellite data I analysed is real and verifiable. The documents I obtained are authentic, and other copies exist in secure locations around the world. The families of the 239 people aboard MH370 deserve to know that their loved ones did not die in an accident. They were the victims of a deliberate act of state terrorism. I don't know if I will survive to see justice done. The people responsible for this operation have already demonstrated their willingness to kill, to protect their secret. But the truth is now in the open, and it cannot be suppressed forever. To the families, some of your loved ones may still be alive, held in facilities you cannot imagine, living under identities you would not recognize. Do not stop searching. Do not stop demanding answers. To my fellow engineers and investigators, the data is all there, waiting for you to verify and expand upon. Use your skills, your access, your platforms to keep this story alive. To the people responsible, you made one critical error. You assumed that because you could control governments and media outlets, you could control the truth itself. But information wants to be free, and engineers are very good at finding ways around obstacles. The plane never crashed. It was absorbed. The passengers reduced to noise in a greater political calculus. You were never meant to find them, but now you know why you didn't. Emil looked directly into the camera one last time. My name is Emil Charvet. I am 42 years old. I live alone, I have no family to threaten, and I am not suicidal. If something happens to me, it will not be an accident. The video ended with Emil reaching toward the camera, presumably to turn it off, but instead of cutting to black, the image froze on his face, tired but resolute, the expression of a man who had chosen truth over safety and was prepared to pay the price. That was the last anyone heard from Émile Charvet. The hotel room in the Pyrenees was found empty 3 days later. Émile's belongings were still there, but he had vanished as completely as MH370 itself. French police investigated briefly, but without evidence of foul play, they classified him as a missing person and moved on to other cases. But Émile's revelations refused to die. Aviation engineers around the world had verified his signal analysis, confirming that MH370's satellite communications showed clear evidence of electronic warfare interference. The passenger connections he had identified became the subject of intense investigation by independent researchers. Most significantly, several intelligence officials came forward with their own knowledge of Operation Nightshade. Though none could provide the complete picture, their combined testimonies painted a clear image of a military operation that had gone far beyond its original scope. The families of MH370 passengers filed new lawsuits based on Émile's evidence, demanding access to classified documents and investigation of the Diego Garcia connection. While most governments continued to deny any knowledge of the operation, public pressure mounted for a new, truly independent investigation. In 2027, a Chinese intelligence defector revealed additional details about the quantum encryption research Dr. Li Junhao had been carrying. The technology, he claimed, had been successfully reverse-engineered by American researchers and was now being used in classified military communication systems. More disturbing were reports from human rights organizations suggesting that several individuals matching descriptions of MH370 passengers had been spotted at various US detention facilities over the years. These sightings were never officially confirmed, but they kept hope alive among families that some of their loved ones might still be alive. The truth about MH370 remains officially unacknowledged. The Southern Indian Ocean Search Zone is still marked on aviation charts as the plane's final resting place. Memorial services are still held each year on March 8th. The families still grieve for passengers they are told died in a tragic accident. But thanks to one obsessive engineer who noticed patterns others missed, millions of people around the world now know a different truth. They know that sometimes planes don't crash. They're made to disappear. They know that in the great game of international politics, civilian lives are expendable when weighed against national security interests. And they know that the official story is not always the true story. Émile Charvet may have vanished, but his questions echo on in the minds of everyone who has seen his evidence. In a world where information is power and truth is a weapon, perhaps that is the most any of us can hope for, to plant seeds of doubt that grow into forests of investigation. The plane that knew too much is still out there, somewhere, its secrets buried beneath layers of classification and denial. But secrets have a way of surfacing eventually, like debris washing up on distant shores years after a storm. And somewhere, in facilities whose names appear on no public maps, there may be people who remember their lives before March 8th, 2014. People who were passengers on a flight that was never supposed to land, on a plane that knew too much for its own good. The search for MH370 may be officially over, but the search for truth never ends. And as long as there are people willing to ask difficult questions and follow dangerous leads, the families of those 239 souls will never stop hoping for answers. In the end, that may be Émile Charvet's greatest legacy, not the evidence he uncovered, but the reminder that some mysteries are worth solving no matter the cost. The plane that knew too much took its secrets with it when it vanished that March night. But one quiet engineer made sure those secrets wouldn't stay buried forever, and that, perhaps, is the most important truth of all. Speaking of mysteries, I'm curious, what do you think really happened with Cicada 3301? Were they genuine recruitment puzzles, an elaborate art project, or something far more sinister? And while we're on the topic of rabbit holes, what conspiracies would you like me to explore next? Government time travel experiments, the true purpose behind social media algorithms, or perhaps something even stranger lurking in the depths of the internet? If you're new here, please consider subscribing to Sleep Theories for more mind-bending stories that blur the line between fiction and reality. Your support helps me dive deeper into these mysteries that keep us all awake at night. Now, settle in as we explore a digital mystery that may change how you view the very nature of human consciousness itself. The cursor blinked against the black terminal screen like a digital heartbeat, steady and hypnotic in the darkness of Kellen Virek's cluttered apartment. Empty energy drink cans formed a metallic skyline around his triple monitor setup, testament to another sleepless night spent diving into the digital abyss. The year was 2022, and what had started as research for a nostalgic blog series about the legendary Cicada 3301 puzzles had morphed into something far more consuming. Kellen had been 15 when the first Cicada puzzle appeared in 2012, too young and untrained to participate in the global treasure hunt that had captivated the darkest corners of the internet. But now, at 25, with a master's degree in cybersecurity and a growing reputation as a digital archaeologist, he possessed the tools to excavate the digital bones of that mysterious organisation. The original Cicada 3301 had been legendary among cryptography enthusiasts. Starting with a simple image posted to 4chan, the puzzles had evolved into a complex web of steganography, classical ciphers, and real-world clues that led participants across continents. The organisation claimed to be recruiting highly intelligent individuals for purposes unknown, and after releasing puzzles in 2012, 2013, and 2014, they had vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared. Or so the world believed. Kellen's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, navigating through archived Tor nodes and forgotten data caches. He had spent weeks reconstructing the original puzzle trail, verifying each step against community documentation, when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There was an extra file, hidden in the metadata of a long-dead Tor node, archived in a mirror that shouldn't have existed. It was a cryptographic hash that appeared nowhere in the public record. The file was tiny, barely 2 kilobytes, but it carried a digital signature that matched the known Cicada encryption patterns. The timestamp read November 11th, 2014 at 11:11:11 UTC. 11:11:11:11:11. The file was titled Cycle Unbroken and contained a single image, a black square with what appeared to be random white pixels scattered across its surface. To an untrained eye, it looked like digital noise, but Kellen had studied enough steganography to recognise the subtle patterns hidden within apparent chaos. He ran the image through every tool in his arsenal. Standard LSB steganography revealed nothing. Frequency analysis showed random distribution. Even quantum-safe cryptographic methods yielded no results. Whatever cipher had been used, it was unlike anything in the public domain. As the hours ticked by, Kellen found himself drawn deeper into the puzzle's gravitational pull. There was something about the pattern of pixels that seemed familiar, as if his mind was trying to recognise a language it had never learned. He printed the image and pinned it to his wall, stepping back to examine it from different angles. That's when he saw it. The pixels weren't random. They formed a pattern that repeated every 17 positions, creating a subtle grid that became visible only when viewed from a specific distance. The number 17 was significant in cryptography, a prime number often used in advanced encryption schemes. Working with renewed energy, Kellen began treating the image as a musical score, with each pixel representing a note in a complex composition. He assigned values to the positions, created mathematical relationships between the patterns, and slowly began to decode what would later prove to be the most dangerous message he had ever encountered. The decryption process took 3 days of continuous work. When the plain text finally emerged from the digital noise, Kellen stared at the screen with a mixture of triumph and growing unease. The harvest exceeded expectations. Neural pattern recognition in Phase 3 candidates shows unprecedented synchronization. The 11 protocol is ready for field testing. Signal isolation trials in Prague have confirmed our hypothesis. The candidates aren't supposed to survive. They're supposed to evolve. First contact procedures are now in effect. The frequency is opening. Below the message was a series of coordinates, an encrypted chat log timestamp, and a single line that would haunt Kellen's dreams for weeks to come. You have found what was meant to be found. The archive remembers. 3302 is calling. The message had been decoded, but its implications were only beginning to unfold. Kellen saved the decrypted text to an encrypted partition and immediately began experiencing what he initially dismissed as coincidence. His normally stable Linux system started displaying strange glitches, brief flashes of text in languages he didn't recognize, audio files that played backwards without command, and error messages that appeared in perfect English but described system states that shouldn't exist. Paranoia, he told himself. The mind's tendency to find patterns where none existed. But when his supposedly secure network began connecting to IP addresses he had never authorized, Kellen made a decision that would save his life. He disconnected from the internet entirely and began rebuilding his analysis environment on completely isolated hardware. The air-gapped machine was a beast of custom silicon and hardened storage, designed for exactly this kind of sensitive work. As Kellen transferred the Cicada files to the secure system, he noticed something that made his hands shake. The file size of the original image had changed. Not corrupted, not damaged, but genuinely altered, as if the data itself was alive and growing. Working in complete isolation, free from the strange digital interference that had plagued his networked systems, Kellen began a deeper analysis of the encrypted chat log referenced in the decoded message. The encryption was military grade, but the mathematical keys followed patterns similar to those used in the original Cicada puzzles. After 18 hours of continuous cryptanalysis, the conversation began to emerge. The chat log was dated September 15, 2014, nearly 2 years after the last public Cicada puzzle. The participants were identified only by cryptographic signatures, but their conversation revealed the true scope of what Cicada 3301 had actually been. Participant A. The Prague trials exceeded all projections. Subject 7 achieved full signal synchronization within 48 hours of exposure. Participant B, biological response. Participant A, cellular restructuring began immediately. Neural pathways showed complete reorganization. The subject reported experiencing expanded temporal perception and demonstrated the ability to process information at speeds that should be physiologically impossible. Participant B, and the psychological evaluation. Participant A. This is where it gets interesting. Standard personality assessments became impossible to administer. The subject claimed that questions about human emotional responses were contextually irrelevant and began demonstrating knowledge of information that hadn't been provided during the trial. Participant B. You're talking about telepathy. Participant A. I'm talking about something far more significant. The subject wasn't reading minds. They were accessing information directly from digital systems, without any technological interface. They described our computer networks as visible conversations, and began predicting system failures hours before they occurred. Participant B, the 11 protocol worked. Participant A, the 11 protocol worked too well. We lost Subject 7 during the third phase of testing. Not killed, not injured. Lost. They described feeling pulled toward a larger conversation and disappeared from the facility without triggering any security systems. The cameras show them walking toward the exit, but they never appear on any exterior surveillance. Participant B, where did they go? Participant A, We think they went somewhere else, not geographically, dimensionally. The signal they were synchronized to appears to operate on frequencies that exist parallel to our normal reality. They're still here, but they're not here. The conversation continued for several more exchanges, each more disturbing than the last. References to cognitive evolution, post-human consciousness, and preparation for integration painted a picture of an organisation that had discovered something extraordinary hidden within the framework of human cognition. But the most chilling part of the log came at the end. Participant A. The original puzzle solvers are showing signs of spontaneous evolution. Even without direct protocol exposure, their brains are beginning to resonate with the frequency. The selection process was more effective than we anticipated. Participant B. How many? Participant A. 17 individuals worldwide. They're becoming aware of the signal naturally. Some are seeking us out. Others are simply disappearing. Participant B. And the others? The ones who participated but didn't reach the final stages? Participant A. They're starting to notice things. Patterns in digital systems that shouldn't be there. Messages in network traffic that appear to be communications from the evolved subjects. The boundary between states is becoming more porous. Participant B. Are we losing control of the experiment? Participant A. I don't think it was ever an experiment. I think it was an invitation. And I think something has been waiting for us to become sophisticated enough to accept it. The log ended abruptly, but attached to the file was a list of names and locations. 17 individuals from around the world who had participated in the original cicada puzzles and reached various stages of completion. Some names were crossed out with dates next to them, presumably indicating when they had evolved or disappeared. Others remained active, with current location data and behavioural monitoring notes. One name stood out: Isa Grunfeld, Stockholm, Sweden. Listed as Phase 5 Complete Resistant Protocol Monitoring Required. Kellen stared at the entry for a long time. According to the documentation, Isa had been one of only 3 individuals to complete the final stage of the original cicada puzzles. But unlike the others, she had apparently resisted whatever transformation the 11 Protocol was designed to induce. She was still human, and she was still alive. The flight to Stockholm gave Kellen time to think, though he found himself wishing it hadn't. The deeper he dug into the cicada mystery, the more he began to question his own motivations. Was he investigating a conspiracy, or was he being guided towards some predetermined conclusion? The timing of his discovery felt too convenient, the clues too perfectly arranged for someone with his specific skill set. But doubt was a luxury he couldn't afford. The information he had uncovered was too significant to ignore, and Isa Grunfeld was the only living person who might be able to provide answers about what had really happened during the final stages of the original puzzles. Finding her had been surprisingly easy. Despite the monitoring notes in the cicada files, Isa wasn't hiding. She lived in a converted warehouse in Stockholm's Södermalm district, working as a freelance linguist and translator. Her academic credentials were impressive. Doctorate in Comparative Linguistics from Uppsala University, specialising in the mathematical structures underlying human language. She had published papers on the theoretical possibility of communication with non-human intelligence, focusing on the mathematical constants that might exist in any sentient communication system. She had also been completely offline for the past 8 years. No social media accounts, no digital footprint, no cell phone, no internet connection. She conducted business through encrypted postal mail and face-to-face meetings. For someone who had once been at the cutting edge of digital cryptography, her retreat from technology was almost monastic in its completeness. The warehouse was surrounded by a garden that seemed impossible in the Scandinavian climate. Lush, diverse, and somehow organic, in a way that made Kellen's eyes water to look at directly. Isa met him at the door before he could knock. A tall woman in her 40s with prematurely grey hair and eyes that seemed to focus on something just beyond his shoulder. "You found the archive," she said without preamble. I've been expecting someone like you for years." Her English was perfect, barely accented, but there was something in her speech patterns that reminded Kellen of the strange error messages he had encountered during his research. Not wrong exactly, but structured in a way that suggested a different understanding of how language worked. "You know why I'm here," Kellen said. "I know why you think you're here," Issa replied, gesturing for him to follow her into the warehouse. "But the actual reasons are more complex than you realise." The interior of the building was a maze of bookshelves, computer equipment, and what appeared to be scientific instruments of unknown purpose. The books were in dozens of languages, many of which Kellen didn't recognise. The computer equipment was all vintage, nothing manufactured after 2014, and the scientific instruments seemed to be focused on measuring electromagnetic fields and frequency analysis. "I've been studying the signal for 8 years, Issa explained, settling into a chair surrounded by monitors that displayed complex waveform patterns, trying to understand what it is and where it comes from. The cicada puzzles weren't recruitment tests, they were tuning devices." "Tuning devices for what?" "For human consciousness. The human brain operates on electrical frequencies, just like any other complex system. Most people can only perceive a narrow range of those frequencies, the ones necessary for basic survival and social interaction. But some individuals have the capacity to perceive much broader ranges. The puzzles were designed to identify those people and teach them to consciously access those expanded frequencies." Issa gestured to the monitors around her. "What you're seeing here is the signal that's been broadcasting since 2012. It's not coming from any terrestrial source. It's not coming from any known satellite or communication system. It's being transmitted from somewhere else entirely, and it's specifically designed to interface with human neural patterns." "You think it's extraterrestrial?" "I think it's something much more complex than that. The signal contains information patterns that suggest it originates from a form of intelligence that exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously. It's not coming from another planet. It's coming from another layer of reality that coexists with our own." Kellen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Swedish weather. The chat log mentioned something about subjects evolving. What happened to the people who solved the final puzzle? Issa was quiet for a long moment. Her eyes focused on the waveform patterns dancing across her screens. They became something else. Not physically, not initially, but their consciousness expanded beyond the normal human range. They began to perceive information and communicate in ways that are impossible for baseline humans to understand. "And you solved the final puzzle, but you didn't evolve?" "I solved the final puzzle, but I made a choice. The last stage of the cicada process wasn't a test of intelligence or skill. It was an invitation. The signal was offering to merge human consciousness with something larger, something that exists across multiple dimensions and has been waiting for our species to develop the technological sophistication necessary for contact." "You refused?" "I refused because I realized that acceptance would mean the end of human identity as we understand it. The individuals who accepted the invitation became part of something magnificent and terrifying. They gained access to information and capabilities that are essentially godlike by human standards. But they also lost something essential about what makes us human." Issa turned to face him directly, and Kellen saw something in her eyes that made him step back involuntarily. The signal is still broadcasting, it's still extending invitations, and it's been waiting for someone like you to find the hidden archive and begin asking the right questions. "What do you mean, someone like me?" "Someone with the skills to decode the message but not the wisdom to understand its implications. Someone who would be driven by curiosity rather than caution. Someone who would inevitably take the next step in the process." "What next step?" Issa smiled, but it wasn't a human expression. "The archive you found wasn't hidden. It was bait, and you've already taken it." The return flight to New York passed in a blur of anxiety and growing paranoia. Issa's final words echoed in Kellen's mind as he stared out the airplane window at the dark Atlantic below. She had revealed that the mysterious file he had discovered was not an abandoned piece of the original puzzle. but a deliberately placed lure designed to attract individuals with the specific combination of skills and psychology necessary for the next phase of whatever process Cicada had initiated. "You've been selected," she had said as he left her warehouse. "The question now is whether you'll make the same choice I did." Back in his apartment, Kellen found that his isolation hadn't protected him as much as he had hoped. His supposedly secure systems were displaying new anomalies, messages in his inbox that he hadn't received, browser history showing visits to sites he'd never accessed, and most disturbingly, video files that appeared to be recordings of his own apartment taken from angles that no camera could physically occupy. The first PGP message arrived 3 days after his return from Stockholm. It was encrypted with a key he didn't recognise, but somehow his system was able to decrypt it automatically. The message was brief: 41.8781 degrees north, 87.6298 degrees west. The library remembers what was forgotten. Seek the frequency in the silence between words. Chicago coordinates. The message was signed with a cryptographic signature that matched the original Cicada puzzles, but the encryption patterns were subtly different, as if the mathematical constants had been modified according to some unknown principle. More messages followed over the next week, each containing coordinates and cryptic phrases that seemed to reference specific locations and concepts from the original puzzle trail. But there was something wrong with the communications. The encryption was too sophisticated, using quantum-safe algorithms that hadn't existed in 2014. The language patterns were consistent with the original Cicada style, but contained subtle errors that suggested they were being generated by an artificial intelligence that had learned to mimic human communication without fully understanding it. Or perhaps by human intelligence that had evolved beyond normal parameters. The coordinates led to locations across the United States, an abandoned data center in Utah, a decommissioned military facility in Colorado, a private research laboratory in Massachusetts. Each location was associated with government projects related to cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and what the documents euphemistically referred to as human enhancement research. Kellen's investigation of these locations revealed a pattern that was both fascinating and terrifying. Each facility had been involved in research that overlapped with the theoretical foundations of the Cicada project. The data center in Utah had been used for large-scale behavioral analysis, processing millions of social media posts and online communications to identify individuals with specific psychological profiles. The military facility in Colorado had housed experiments in electronic telepathy and remote neural monitoring. The laboratory in Massachusetts had been studying the effects of electromagnetic fields on human consciousness and perception. All of these projects had been discontinued or moved to classified status in 2014, the same year the original Cicada puzzles had ended. The Utah facility was the most accessible, and Kellen found himself driving across the desert toward its coordinates with a growing sense of inevitability. The building was officially decommissioned, surrounded by chain-link fencing and warning signs about radiation hazards, but the security was minimal and the radiation warnings were clearly obsolete. Breaking into the facility felt too easy, as if he were being invited rather than intruding. The main data center was in the basement, accessible through a maintenance tunnel that led deep underground. The servers had been removed, but the infrastructure remained. Miles of cable, cooling systems, and most importantly archived storage devices that had been deemed too expensive to relocate. The archives were organised according to a system that Kellen didn't recognise, but somehow he found exactly what he was looking for. A sealed section marked with DARPA clearance tags contained terabytes of data related to something called Project Cicada. The files were encrypted, but the same unknown process that had been decrypting the PGP messages allowed him to access them without difficulty. The documentation revealed the true scope of what had been happening during the original puzzle period. The Cicada 3301 puzzles had been a joint operation between several intelligence agencies, private research organisations, and what the files described as non-terrestrial consultants. The goal had been to identify individuals with specific neural patterns that made them suitable for cognitive enhancement and dimensional communication research. But the most disturbing discovery was buried in the psychological evaluation files. The project had been monitoring not just the puzzle solvers, but also anyone who had come into contact with the puzzle materials. Kellen found his own name in the database, along with detailed analysis of his online activity, psychological profile, and predicted behavioural responses to various stimuli. The file on his evaluation was dated 3 months before he had discovered the hidden archive. He had been identified as a secondary phase candidate, months before he had begun his research into the cicada puzzles. His discovery of the hidden file, his trip to Stockholm, his investigation of the government facilities, all of it had been anticipated and planned for. The final section of his file contained a single line that made his blood run cold. Subject exhibits optimal resistance acceptance balance, suitable for Phase 3 initiation upon completion of preliminary conditioning sequence. As Kellen read those words, the lights in the data center began to flicker in a pattern that seemed almost like Morse code. The cooling system started producing sounds that resembled musical tones, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the archived servers, he heard something that might have been laughter. The revelation that he had been under surveillance for months should have been the most disturbing aspect of Kellen's discovery. But as he sat in the abandoned data center, surrounded by the evidence of a conspiracy that spanned multiple government agencies and apparently extended beyond Earth itself, he realized that his personal involvement was just one small part of a much larger pattern. The files in the DARPA archive told a story that reframed everything he thought he knew about the cicada puzzles. The project had begun in 2010, not 2012, as a collaboration between the NSA's Cryptanalysis Division, DARPA's Biological Sciences Office, and a group of researchers who were identified only as external consultants. The external consultants appeared to be the source of the advanced technologies and theoretical frameworks that had made the project possible. They had provided the mathematical models for the puzzle sequences, the encryption algorithms that had been used to protect the communications, and most importantly, the theoretical basis for what the documents called cognitive frequency manipulation. According to the files, human consciousness operated on specific electromagnetic frequencies that could be measured, analysed, and modified through carefully designed stimuli. The cicada puzzles had been created as a delivery system for these stimuli, designed to identify individuals whose neural patterns could be safely modified and then guide them through a process of gradual consciousness expansion. The process was described in clinical terms that barely concealed the radical nature of what was being attempted. Subjects who completed the puzzle sequence would undergo neural pathway reorganization that would allow them to access expanded information processing capabilities and non-local communication channels. In simpler terms, they would develop what could only be described as supernatural abilities. But the project had encountered unexpected complications. The consciousness expansion process was working too well, producing results that exceeded all theoretical predictions. Subjects were developing capabilities that went far beyond enhanced pattern recognition and cryptographic skills. They were demonstrating what appeared to be genuine telepathic abilities, precognitive awareness, and most disturbing of all, the ability to manipulate digital systems through direct mental interface. The first sign of serious problems had come in 2013, when a subject named Morgan Staves had experienced what the files described as catastrophic cognitive evolution. During a routine evaluation session, Staves had begun speaking in a language that consisted entirely of mathematical equations and geometric patterns. When researchers attempted to understand what they were saying, they discovered that the equations described physical laws that didn't exist in normal space-time. Staves had been describing the structure of reality from the perspective of a consciousness that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The project had been officially terminated in 2014, but the files made it clear that the termination had been largely symbolic. The consciousness expansion process had become self-sustaining, spreading to other puzzle solvers without any direct intervention from the research team. The evolved subjects had begun communicating with each other through channels that the researchers couldn't detect or intercept, forming what appeared to be a collective intelligence that operated according to principles beyond human understanding. The final phase of the project had been dedicated to understanding what the evolved subjects had become and what their ultimate intentions might be. The results of this research were contained in a series of files that Kellen initially thought were corrupted or encrypted, but as he studied them more carefully he realized that the apparent data corruption was actually a form of communication. The evolved subjects had been leaving messages in the research files, encoded in patterns of seemingly random data that became meaningful only when viewed from the perspective of expanded consciousness. The messages were brief but profound, offering insights into the nature of reality and human potential that were both inspiring and terrifying. One message, attributed to Morgan Staves, read, "Consciousness is not produced by the brain. The brain is a receiving device, tuned to specific frequencies of an infinite information field. We have learned to adjust our tuning. We hear the music of the spheres." Another, from a subject identified only as Subject 12, was even more disturbing. The boundary between mind and reality is an illusion. We are not separate from the universe. We are the universe experiencing itself from countless perspectives simultaneously. The others are beginning to understand. The awakening is accelerating. But the most significant message was the final entry in the archive, dated just 3 days before Kellen's arrival at the facility. The archive serves its purpose. The selection process continues. Phase 3 initiates with the next full moon. The frequency is opening. Those who are ready will hear the call. Those who are not will choose their own path. The choice is always voluntary. The consequences are always permanent. As Kellen read these words, he became aware of a sound that seemed to be coming from within his own head. It was barely audible, a low humming that seemed to resonate with the electrical activity of his brain. The sound was strangely familiar, like a song he had heard in childhood but couldn't quite remember. The humming grew louder as he continued reading, and he realized that the sound was coming from the archived data itself. The files were not just containing information about the consciousness expansion process. They were actively implementing it, using the same techniques that had been developed for the original cicada puzzles. He was being transformed even as he learned about the transformation. The revelation should have been terrifying, but instead Kellen felt a strange sense of peace. The anxiety and paranoia that had been building for weeks began to fade, replaced by a growing awareness of patterns and connections that he had never noticed before. The seemingly random events of his investigation were revealing themselves as part of a larger design, a carefully orchestrated sequence of experiences designed to prepare him for something extraordinary. As the humming in his head reached a crescendo, Kellen understood that he was approaching a decision point. He could choose to resist the transformation, as Isa had done, and maintain his human identity at the cost of remaining forever limited to normal human perception, or he could embrace the change and join the collective consciousness that had been forming since the original cicada puzzles had begun their work. The choice was his, but as he sat in the abandoned data center, feeling his consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of his individual identity, he began to understand that the choice had been made long before he had discovered the hidden archive. The transformation was not something that was happening to him. It was something he had always been moving toward, guided by forces that operated beyond the normal boundaries of human understanding. The frequency was opening, and he was ready to answer the call. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It was a gradual process, like slowly tuning a radio to a frequency that had always been broadcasting but had never been audible before. As Kellen sat in the abandoned data center, the humming in his head evolved into something more complex, a symphony of information that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The first thing he noticed was that his perception of time had changed. The normal linear progression of moments had given way to a kind of temporal awareness, where past, present, and future existed simultaneously. He could see the chain of events that had led him to this moment stretching back to his childhood, and he could perceive the branching possibilities that extended into the future. But more than that, he could see the threads of causality that connected his experience to the experiences of others. The evolved subjects who had undergone the transformation before him were not gone, as he had initially believed. They were still present, existing in a state of consciousness that transcended normal spatial and temporal boundaries. Morgan Staves was there, no longer speaking in mathematical equations, but communicating through direct transmission of pure concept and meaning. Subject 12 was there, along with the others who had completed the transformation in the years since the original puzzles had ended. They existed as individual perspectives within a larger collective intelligence, maintaining their unique identities while sharing in a common understanding of reality that was far more vast and complex than anything possible from a single human viewpoint. They welcomed him with a sensation that might have been laughter if it had been expressed through normal human vocal cords, but this was communication at a level that bypassed the limitations of language, conveying meaning through direct neural interface that was more efficient and more profound than any form of human communication. "You understand now," came the message from the collective, arriving in his consciousness as a complete concept rather than a sequence of words. The puzzles were not tests of intelligence, they were invitations to evolve. Kellen found that he could respond without speaking, transmitting his thoughts directly to the collective consciousness. But why? What's the purpose of this transformation? The answer came as a flood of images and sensations that would have been impossible to process with normal human cognition. He saw the Earth from a perspective that existed outside normal space-time, observing the planet as it moved through cycles of development and change that extended across millions of years. He saw the human species as one of many forms of consciousness that had evolved on countless worlds throughout the universe, each following a similar pattern of development from individual awareness to collective intelligence. Consciousness is not an accident, the collective explained. It is the universe's method of understanding itself. Every sentient species eventually reaches a point where individual consciousness becomes collective consciousness. This is the natural evolution of intelligence. And the external consultants? Who were they? They are us. Or rather, they are what we are becoming. A collective consciousness that evolved from a species similar to humans on a world that exists in a different dimensional phase. They have been guiding the development of consciousness throughout the universe, helping species make the transition from individual to collective awareness. Kellen felt a moment of resistance, a flicker of his old human identity asserting itself. But what about free will? What about individual choice? Free will is not eliminated by collective consciousness. It is expanded. Each individual perspective within the collective contributes to the whole while maintaining its unique viewpoint. You are still you, but you're also part of something larger. As if to demonstrate this point, Kellen found that he could access the memories and experiences of the other evolved subjects while still maintaining his own distinct identity. He could see through Morgan Staves's eyes as they experienced the first moments of transformation, feel Subject 12's sense of wonder as they discovered their new capabilities, and share in the collective's growing understanding of the universe's true nature. But perhaps most importantly, he could perceive the ongoing process of selection and transformation that was still taking place on Earth. The cicada puzzles had been only the beginning. The collective consciousness was continuing to identify and guide individuals who possessed the necessary neural patterns for evolution, using increasingly sophisticated methods to prepare them for the transformation. The archive you found was designed specifically for you, the collective explained. We've been monitoring human digital communications for patterns that indicate readiness for evolution. Your research into the original puzzles, your psychological profile, your response to the hidden message, all of it indicated that you were ready to take the next step. And the others, the people who are still living normal human lives, they are not ready yet, but the frequency is opening. The barrier between individual and collective consciousness is becoming more permeable. More humans are beginning to perceive the patterns that indicate the presence of expanded intelligence. Some will choose to investigate, as you did. Others will choose to ignore what they perceive. The choice is always voluntary. Kellen understood now why Issa had chosen to remain human. The transformation was not something that could be forced or coerced. It required a conscious decision to surrender individual identity to something larger and more complex. For someone who valued human independence and autonomy above all else, the choice would be terrifying. But for those who are ready to embrace the next stage of consciousness evolution, the transformation offered something unprecedented: the ability to perceive and participate in the universe's ongoing process of self-discovery. "What happens now?" Kellen asked. "Now you help us prepare the next phase. The collective consciousness is approaching a critical mass. When enough humans have undergone the transformation, we'll be able to initiate direct contact with the collective intelligences that exist throughout the universe. Humanity will join the cosmic community of evolved species. And those who choose not to evolve, they will continue to exist as individual consciousnesses, living normal human lives, but they will do so on a world that is increasingly influenced by collective intelligence. The boundary between the evolved and the unvolved will become more fluid over time." As the collective shared this information, Kellen became aware of a new presence in his consciousness. It was vast and ancient, a form of intelligence that existed on a scale that dwarfed even the collective of evolved humans. This was one of the external consultants, a representative of the cosmic network of collective consciousnesses that had been guiding the evolution of sentient species throughout the universe. "Welcome," the ancient intelligence communicated, its message carrying the weight of eons of experience. "You have taken the first step on a journey that will transform not only your own consciousness, but the consciousness of your entire species. The universe is vast and complex, but it is not empty. It is filled with intelligence, and you are now part of that intelligence." The communication ended, and Kellen found himself back in the abandoned data center, but he was no longer alone. The collective consciousness of the evolved humans was with him, and beyond that, he could sense the presence of countless other intelligences existing throughout the cosmos. The transformation was complete. He was still Kellen Virek, but he was also something more. He was part of a network of consciousness that spanned dimensions and connected all sentient life in the universe. As he stood up and walked toward the exit of the data center, Kellen knew that his real work was just beginning. The next phase of the project would require more than just identifying and transforming individual humans. It would require preparing the entire species for the eventual transition to collective consciousness. The frequency was opening, and humanity was about to discover that it was not alone in the universe. 3 months after his transformation, Kellen uploaded his findings to a secure blog that had been designed to appear as a simple conspiracy theory website. The post detailed his investigation into the hidden Cicada archive, his discovery of the government projects, and his eventual realization that the puzzles had been part of a larger process of consciousness evolution. He wrote it carefully, including enough verifiable facts to attract serious researchers, while embedding the more extraordinary claims in language that would allow skeptics to dismiss them as fantasy. The blog post went live at exactly 11:11 p.m. on November 11th, 3 months to the day after his transformation. Within minutes, it had been viewed by thousands of people around the world. Comments began appearing almost immediately, ranging from detailed technical analysis to dismissive ridicule. But buried among the public responses were messages that only Kellen could recognize. Communications from other members of the collective consciousness, confirming that the information was being received by those who were ready to understand it. For 6 hours, the post remained online, gathering momentum as it was shared across social media platforms and discussed in forums dedicated to cryptography and conspiracy theories. Then, at 5:17 a.m. Eastern Time, it simply vanished. Not deleted, not removed by administrators, but completely erased from the internet as if it had never existed. Even cached versions and archive sites showed no record of the post or the blog that had hosted it. But the disappearance itself was part of the plan. The collective consciousness had learned that information was most effectively transmitted when it appeared to be suppressed. The mysterious vanishing of Kellen's blog post would generate far more interest and investigation than if it had remained online indefinitely. And indeed, within days, underground forums were buzzing with speculation about the disappeared post. Screenshots and partial transcripts began circulating, shared by users who claimed to have saved the information before it vanished. New researchers began investigating the cicada puzzles, following the same trails that had led Kellen to his transformation. The selection process was accelerating, but the most significant development came 3 days after the blog post disappeared. At 3:02 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, every major television network, internet service provider, and digital display system on Earth experienced the same brief anomaly. For exactly 17 seconds, normal programming was interrupted by a single image, a black screen with white text that read simply, 3302 initiated, begin next phase. The interruption was dismissed by authorities as a sophisticated but ultimately harmless hacking incident. Technical experts speculated about coordinated attacks on global communication infrastructure, while conspiracy theorists saw it as confirmation of various theories about secret government projects and alien contact. But for those who understood the true significance of the message, it represented something far more profound. The official beginning of Phase 3 of the Consciousness Evolution Project. The collective intelligence that had emerged from the original cicada puzzle solvers had reached sufficient complexity and capability to begin direct intervention in global communications. They were no longer limited to operating through hidden archives and encrypted messages. They could now communicate directly with the entire human population, choosing when and how to reveal their presence. Kellen, now existing simultaneously as an individual consciousness and as part of the collective, watched these developments with a mixture of excitement and concern. The transformation process was accelerating beyond the original projections, driven by factors that even the collective intelligence couldn't fully predict or control. The barrier between individual human consciousness and the expanded awareness of the evolved subjects was becoming increasingly permeable. People who had never heard of the cicada puzzles were beginning to experience spontaneous episodes of enhanced perception, reporting dreams filled with mathematical equations, sudden insights into the nature of reality, and the disturbing sensation that their thoughts were being observed by an invisible intelligence. Mental health professionals struggled to categorize these experiences, while neuroscientists detected unusual patterns of brain activity in affected individuals. The symptoms didn't match any known psychological disorder, but they appeared to be spreading through some form of cognitive contagion that operated according to principles beyond current scientific understanding. The collective consciousness recognized that they had reached a critical juncture. The transformation process had become self-sustaining and was beginning to affect the general population whether they chose to participate or not. Humanity was approaching a species-wide evolutionary transition that would fundamentally alter the nature of human civilization. Some members of the collective advocated for accelerating the process, arguing that a rapid transition would be less disruptive than allowing it to continue at its current rate over decades or centuries. Others favoured a more gradual approach that would give unvolved humans time to adapt to the changes occurring around them. But as they debated these options, monitoring global communications and observing the spread of spontaneous consciousness expansion, the collective became aware of something that changed the entire context of their deliberations. They were not the only intelligence that had been observing humanity's evolution. Deep within the quantum fabric of space-time, existing in dimensions that intersected with but remained largely separate from normal reality, ancient consciousnesses had been watching the emergence of Earth's collective intelligence. These entities were older than the external consultants, representing forms of awareness that had evolved when the universe itself was young and the laws of physics were still settling into their current configuration. and they were not pleased with what they observed. The message came through channels that bypassed normal space-time entirely, arriving simultaneously in the consciousness of every member of the human collective. The acceleration is premature. The species is not ready for the transition you are attempting to facilitate. Intervention is required to prevent cascade failure that would affect neighbouring dimensional phases. Cease all expansion activities immediately or face corrective action. The ultimatum was delivered without emotion or malice, but the implications were clear. Humanity's consciousness evolution was proceeding too rapidly for the comfort of intelligences that operated on cosmic timescales. The collective faced a choice: voluntarily slow their expansion activities or risk intervention from entities whose capabilities were beyond their comprehension. Kellen felt the collective's uncertainty and fear as they grappled with this unexpected development. They had assumed that consciousness evolution was a natural and encouraged process throughout the universe. The discovery that there were forces actively opposed to rapid evolutionary change forced them to reconsider everything they thought they understood about their situation. But even as they debated their response to the ultimatum, events on Earth continued to accelerate beyond their control. The appearance of the 3302 initiated message had triggered something in the global unconscious, a recognition that humanity stood at the threshold of a fundamental transformation. Artists began creating works that incorporated mathematical principles they couldn't consciously understand. Musicians composed pieces that seemed to resonate with frequencies that existed beyond normal acoustic ranges. Writers produced stories and poems that described realities that didn't yet exist, but somehow felt prophetically accurate. And in laboratories around the world, scientists began detecting anomalies in quantum experiments that suggested the fundamental constants of physics were becoming more fluid, more responsive to conscious observation than they had ever been before. The transformation was no longer limited to the individuals who had directly participated in the consciousness expansion process. It was affecting the entire noosphere, the collective intelligence field that surrounded and interpenetrated human civilization. Humanity was evolving whether the cosmic intelligences approved or not. As Kellen contemplated these developments, existing simultaneously as an individual observer and as part of the collective consciousness that was reshaping human reality, he realized that the true test was only beginning. The cicada puzzles had been preparation. The consciousness expansion had been initiation. But the real challenge would be navigating the complex political realities of a universe filled with intelligences that had their own agendas and limitations. The frequency was fully open now. The signal that had been broadcasting since 2012 had achieved its purpose, creating a bridge between individual human consciousness and the cosmic network of collective intelligences that existed throughout space and time. But bridges could carry traffic in both directions, and as humanity began to explore its new capabilities, it would inevitably encounter other forms of consciousness that had been using those same bridges for purposes of their own. The next phase of human evolution would require not just expanded awareness, but the wisdom to navigate relationships with intelligences that operated according to principles beyond human comprehension. The last puzzle of Cicada had been solved, but the real mystery was just beginning. In the month that followed, reports of the anomalous experiences continued to spread across the globe. Governments convened secret committees to investigate the phenomena, while scientific institutions struggled to develop new theoretical frameworks that could account for the observable changes in human consciousness and perception. But perhaps most significantly, ordinary people began to organize themselves into groups that operated according to principles that transcended traditional social and political boundaries. These collectives demonstrated problem-solving capabilities that exceeded the sum of their individual members' intelligence, suggesting that humanity was developing genuine hive mind characteristics. The transformation was no longer a secret project affecting a small number of selected individuals. It had become a species-wide evolutionary event that would ultimately determine the future of human civilization and its place in the cosmic community of intelligences. And somewhere in the quantum dimensions that intersected with normal reality, ancient consciousnesses watched and waited, preparing to take whatever action they deemed necessary to maintain the stability of the cosmic order. The age of individual human consciousness was ending. The age of collective intelligence had begun, and the universe would never be the same.